Think about getting a glass of water. For many of us, it's just turning on the tap, right? Super simple.
Seems automatic, yeah.
But, for billions of people, that simple act is actually, well, way more complex. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be diving in.
Today, we're looking closely at something often simplified in big reports. How people in low and middle income countries, LMICs, actually get their drinking water.
That's right. Because, these global reports, they usually focus on the primary water source.
The main one.
The main one, exactly. But what we're finding, based on a big review of research, is that loads of households actually rely on several different sources, not just one.
It's a much more mixed picture on the ground.
So our mission today is to unpack that. Just how common is this? Why do people do it? And what does it mean for, health? And how we even track progress on safe water goals.
It's about getting a more nuanced view, really. Uncovering maybe some hidden risks.
Okay, let's start there then. How common is this use of multiple water sources? What are we calling it? So the term used in the review is multiple water source use, or MWSU.
MWSU, got it.
And it's defined pretty simply. Just a household using more than one source for drinking water over a period.
And is it widespread?
Oh, absolutely. The review found evidence of MWSU in 43 different countries.
43, wow. Across how many continents?
4 continents. And it's happening in both urban and rural areas. It's not just one or the other.
Okay, so it's global, it's urban, it's rural. But what about the numbers? What percentage of people are actually doing this?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The studies reported a huge range.
A range? How big?
Anywhere from, say, 4% of households in one study, all the way up to 100% in another.
100%. So everyone in that specific study area was using multiple sources.
Apparently so, in that particular context. It really shows how varied the situation can be and maybe how different studies measure it.
Yeah, that's a massive difference. Is there any sort of average figure?
There was one large survey looked across Asia and Africa, and it found, on average, about 42.3% of households were using multiple sources.
42%. So nearly half, on average, in those regions? That's significant. It's not a niche thing at all.
Not at all. And some places seem to have particularly high rates. Ghana, for instance, came up a lot in the review.
Ghana? What did the studies there show?
Well, Ghana had the most studies looking into this, and the rates reported were between roughly 54% and 96%.
96% in some cases. That's almost everybody.
It really makes you wonder about focusing only on that primary source, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Now, you mentioned the data might not show the full global picture. Why is that?
Just because, well, it hasn't been studied everywhere. There are many regions where this kind of detailed water use just hasn't been investigated much.
Right, so the 43 countries is where we have data, but it could be happening elsewhere too, undocumented.
Exactly. It's very likely more widespread than the current documented evidence suggests.
Okay, and you said urban and rural areas both see this. Are there clear differences? Does it look different in a city versus a village?
Interestingly, the overall range of reported MWSU was pretty similar. Rural studies found rates from 13 to 93%.
Okay.
Urban studies from about 7 up to 100%. And studies that didn't specify. Also a wide range, 4 to 85%.
So no simple rule like it's more common in rural areas?
Not based on those overall ranges, no.
Mm-hmm.
But some individual studies did compare directly.
Oh, okay. What did they find?
Well, one in Kenya, for example, reported higher rates in rural areas, 98% versus 86% in urban areas.
Higher in rural there, okay.
But then another study, this one Nigeria, found no significant difference in the number of sources people use between urban and rural households.
So it's complicated. Context really matters, it seems.
Definitely. And there was a suggestion maybe that urban households might sometimes use a greater number of different sources, even if the overall prevalence rate isn't always higher.
Interesting, like maybe juggling more options or dealing with more varied unreliability in cities?
Potentially, yeah. Like one study noted rural users tapping up to 4 sources, while urban users in Kenya might use even more.
Huh. Okay, that's MWSU. But the review also mentioned something called SUSU, Supplemental Unimproved Source Use.
Yes, SUSU. That's a really crucial concept.
What does it mean exactly?
It's when a household has what's classified as an improved primary source, like piped water or a protected well.
Okay, so they look safe on paper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they also use an unimproved source, like surface water from a river, or an unprotected well for drinking at some point during the year.
Ah, so they're supplementing their safe water with potentially unsafe water.
Precisely. And this happens globally. It's a hidden vulnerability, really, because these households might be counted as having safe access based only on that primary source.
That definitely wouldn't show up if you just ask, what's your main water source? Okay, so we know this is happening. How did the researchers in these studies actually figure this out? What methods did they use?
Well, the review itself looked at 74 specific articles, selected from over 5,000 initially, so quite a process.
Wow, yeah. What kinds of studies were they?
Mostly cross-sectional, meaning they looked at water use at one point in time. That was 64 of them.
Like a snapshot.
Exactly. But there were also 5 longitudinal studies, which followed households over time.
Ah, so tracking changes.
Yes, and 4 intervention studies looking at the impact of, say, a new water project.
Got it. And how did they collect the actual data from people?
Primarily through surveys and interviews, directly asking households about all the sources they use.
Makes sense. Just ask them.
Right, but some studies also use mixed methods. They combine the surveys with observation or focus group discussions.
Observation, like watching how people collect and use water.
Yeah, tracking behaviors around water sources, how they store it, things like that. And focus groups helped understand community views, why they prefer certain sources, how water is managed locally.
And these other methods, did they help uncover MWSU specifically?
They often provided insights, even if MWSU wasn't the main research question. The review noted that these qualitative methods, being more open-ended, could actually reduce bias.
How so?
Because researchers weren't just asking preset questions about sources they already knew. They could uncover reasons and practices they hadn't anticipated.
Right, you might miss the why if you only use a strict questionnaire. Okay, what about seasonality? Water availability changes drastically between wet and dry seasons, right? How do they account for that?
That's a critical point. Some studies tackled it directly by collecting data in both the wet and dry seasons.
Okay, comparing directly.
Others, even the cross-sectional ones done in one season, would ask people to recall their water use in the other season.
Trying to get that year-round picture even from a single visit.
Exactly. Like a study in Brazil deliberately went in the wet season, thinking people might be, more amenable to providing samples then. It shows researchers are thinking about these dynamics.
Okay, so a mix of strategies to capture that seasonal variation. It sounds like this review pulled together a lot of different types of evidence. Right, let's get into the reasons. Why are people using multiple sources? Seasonality seems like a big one you mentioned.
Absolutely. It came up again and again, especially for people who rely on rainwater.
Rainwater harvesting. Yeah, great in the wet season, but then...
Exactly. When the dry season hits, that source often diminishes or disappears, forcing a switch. And they might switch to an improved source or sometimes an unimproved one.
Can you give examples? What do people switch to?
Sure. The review found cases of switching to improved sources like water kiosks in Malawi.
Those are like community taps where you pay, right?
Yeah, often managed locally. Also bottled water in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, piped water connections in Ghana or Mexico, or boreholes in Ghana.
And why switch from rainwater if it's free?
Well, in the wet season, rainwater might be plentiful right at home. But accessing those other improved sources might mean longer distances, queues, maybe cost. So rainwater is just more convenient when available.
Okay, that makes sense. But you said sometimes the switch is to unimproved sources in the dry season. That sounds like the SUSU pattern.
It is. That's a key pathway to SESU. Switching to things like surface water rivers, lakes in places like the Solomon Islands, Mexico, Vietnam, Bangladesh. Or using unprotected wells found in Uganda, the Marshall Islands, Mexico. This often happened in rural areas, maybe where reliable, improved options just aren't available year-round.
So the lack of reliable alternatives is a factor there, and it's not always a clean switch, is it? You mentioned supplementing too.
Right. Sometimes people supplement rainwater even during the wet season, using other sources alongside it. It's not always an either-or.
Were there other seasonal drivers besides just rainwater running out?
Yes. Things like perception of quality changing. In Nigeria, some people switched away from boreholes in the dry season, thinking the quality decreased, and started using packaged water instead.
Interesting. So not just quantity, but perceived quality.
Exactly. Also, physical access issues. Flooding in the rainy season could break hand pumps or stop water vendors getting through, as seen in Kenya.
Right.
Or in Bangladesh. Surface water might stagnate in the dry season, changing how people feel about using it.
And this links to aesthetics too, right? Taste, smell, color.
Definitely. That Vietnam study showed people's opinion of well water and rainwater decreased in the dry season, while their opinion of the aesthetics of vendor or surface water actually went up.
It's amazing how much those sensory aspects matter in choices. So, MWSU helps people adapt seasonally, but the safety net isn't always, well, safe.
Precisely. The safety of the supplemental source is key. Okay, what about year-round problems? The review mentioned issues with the primary source itself.
Yes, that's another major driver, independent of seasons. Things like the main supply just being unreliable.
How unreliable? Like breaking down frequently or being intermittent, only available certain hours a day, or just not providing enough water for the household's needs?
And how common is that as a reason for MWSU?
Studies reported this reason affecting anywhere from 10% up to 84% of households, depending on the location.
84% in some places. That's huge. What are some examples?
Well, in Zimbabwe, people described boreholes breaking down often, so they needed alternatives. In Nigeria, one study found over half the households supplementing with unimproved water after major breakdowns of their primary source.
Wow. Over half turning to unimproved sources due to breakdowns.
And in India, a study found 64% of households with piped water only got it for 1-3 hours a day.
1 to 3 hours. You can't run a household on that. You'd have to find other sources.
Exactly, which often means turning to packaged water or water vendors.
Ah, the transported water option. How common is that as a supplement?
Very common. The review found usage rates between about 2% and 92% across different studies.
92%. Where was that?
That was in Ecuador, where urban households relied heavily on bottled water because the pipe supply was so intermittent. In Mexico, people spent a lot on bottled water too.
So there's a real economic cost to unreliable infrastructure. And it's striking that even having piped water doesn't stop MWSU or even SUSU.
Absolutely critical point. Piped water unreliability was mentioned in 23 studies as driving MWSU.
23 studies.
And 9 specifically linked it to SCSU, meaning people with unreliable piped water were turning to unimproved sources as a backup.
Even if the pipe comes right into their yard or house?
Even then, people with on-plot piped water in Sri Lanka were still using wells. In rural India, households with piped connections used open wells or surface water when the pipes failed or weren't enough.
It really hammers home that access means more than just having the connection. It has to be reliable and sufficient. Okay, so seasonality, primary source failure. What else influences these choices?
Aesthetics and quality perceptions, even outside of seasonal changes. Taste, smell, appearance matter a lot.
Like the Ghana example you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Preferring river water taste over safer borehole water. Or, in Nigeria, switching from boreholes due to perceived quality issues. In Mexico City, distrust of tap water quality, plus preferring the taste of bottled water, drove supplementation.
So trust and preference are big factors. What about practical things like distance and cost?
Huge factors. If the better quality water is too far away or too expensive, people will use closer, cheaper, potentially lower quality options.
Examples.
Low-income households in urban Cameroon using neighborhood ponds because treated water was unaffordable.
Ponds, okay.
People in Nigeria using surface water because vended water costs too much. Long queues at improved sources were another factor. Or just the sheer convenience of packaged water, even if it costs more, pushing people to use it alongside other sources.
It really is a complex calculation for households every day, balancing safety, cost, time, convenience, taste.
It's a constant juggling act, not just picking the best source.
Right. Okay, so we see why it happens. Now, the implications. You mentioned global monitoring often overlooks this.
That's a major finding. The way we track progress, like for the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 6 on water, it mainly asks about the primary source. This review makes it clear that this misses the huge reality of MWSU, and especially SUSU.
And by missing SUSU, we're likely overestimating how many people have truly safe water.
Exactly. Because we're not counting that use of unimproved sources by people who already have an improved primary one. One estimate suggested this could mean we're undercounting unimproved water use by up to nearly 14%.
14% is a big gap in understanding, and that has direct health consequences, obviously.
Absolutely. Unimproved sources are riskier. SUSU is a direct, uncounted pathway for exposure to contamination.
And even occasional use is risky.
Yes. Research shows that even drinking contaminated water for just a few days a year, maybe when your main source is interrupted, can significantly increase risks of diarrheal diseases and other infections. It can basically negate the benefits of having the improved source most of the time.
Wow. So consistency is key. And what about storing water? Does mixing sources cause problems?
It can, yes. If people collect water from both improved and unimproved sources and mix them in the same container at home.
Right, you could contaminate the clean water.
Precisely. That's another documented risk factor that complicates the picture.
So our overall understanding of water safety seems potentially flawed if we ignore MWSU and SUSU.
That's what the review argues. Our current knowledge is limited, there's bias in where studies have been done, and the whole issue just hasn't been explored enough.
And the factors driving it are probably very local, right?
Highly context-specific.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, seasonality can mess with results from one-off cross-sectional studies. A snapshot in the rainy season looks different from one in the dry season.
And the current benchmarks for reliability, like water being available 12 hours a day, they don't capture SUSU either.
No, because people might still use unsafe sources during the off hours or due to other factors, even if the 12-hour mark is met. And even improved supplemental sources like packaged water aren't always safe. We know sachet water, for example, can sometimes be contaminated.
It seems like our standard metrics just aren't sophisticated enough for the reality. This must also affect water projects, interventions.
Huge implications there. If you design a new water system, assuming everyone will use it exclusively,
But they don't because they keep using other sources.
then your projections for water use and maybe the revenue needed to sustain the system could be way off.
Making the project financially unstable.
Potentially, yes. Understanding why households choose certain sources is critical for designing projects that actually work and last.
And it could affect how we measure the health impact, too.
Definitely. If people are still getting sick from secondary, unsafe sources even after a new, improved primary source is introduced, the health gains might look disappointing. It could explain why some interventions don't show the expected health benefits. The mixing of waters further complicates measuring impact.
That makes sense. You could build a state-of-the-art system, but if reliability issues push people back to contaminated wells sometimes, the overall health picture won't improve as much as hoped. And climate change, how does that fit in?
It's expected to make things worse. More extreme weather droughts, floods,
Yeah.
these impact water source availability, the quality, even the taste and smell. This could drive more MWSU and SUSU as people scramble to adapt.
So climate change adds another layer of stress and complexity.
Exactly. How households cope depends on location, income, perceptions, cost, convenience. MWSU might offer some resilience, but often at a higher cost, buying water, spending more time collecting.
And things like borrowing water from neighbors.
That's a common coping strategy, but it relies on social ties and can get strained, especially if scarcity becomes more frequent or severe due to climate change.
So we really need to understand these dynamics better, especially with climate change unfolding. What does the review say about knowledge gaps? What do we need to do?
Big gaps remain. We need more data on MWSU challenges region by region, what the common secondary sources are, and the specific health risks.
And how do we get that data?
The main recommendation is to change how we do surveys. We need to ask about all sources used, not just the primary one. Ask about the proportion of water from each source and how use changes seasonally. The WHO actually has extended questions on this that could become standard.
So more detailed questioning. What else?
Longitudinal studies tracking people over time are really valuable. And water diaries, where households record their use daily or weekly.
Water diaries, have they been effective?
Yes, studies using them have shown they're great at capturing those day-to-day fluctuations and revealing reliance on unimproved sources that snapshot surveys miss.
Interesting. Any role for new tech?
Potentially, yes. Things like remote sensing or sensors on water points could supplement traditional methods. And crucially, we need to capture the quantity of water from each source for proper risk assessment.
Quantity, not just presence-absence.
Exactly. And figure out the reliability thresholds, like how many hours does the pipe water need to be off before people start using the risky pond? We need to understand those triggers.
It sounds like a call for a fundamental shift in how we monitor and think about water access. Less simplification, more embracing the complexity.
That's the core message. We need a much more accurate picture to truly understand safe water access and exposure risks.
This has been really illuminating. It's clear that MWSU isn't some minor exception. It's a widespread reality in many parts of the world, driven by complex factors.
A reality often hidden by our focus on just the primary source.
And the implications, especially around SUSU, supplementing improved water with unimproved, are pretty serious for health and for accurately tracking progress.
Understanding this is vital for making water projects effective and building resilience, especially with climate change pressures mounting.
Absolutely. So it leaves us and you listening with a big question, doesn't it? If this is the complex reality on the ground, how do we adapt our global efforts? How can we design strategies that ensure genuinely safe, reliable water access for everyone, acknowledging this juggling of sources?
It challenges our assumptions for sure.
It really does. Maybe it's time to look beyond the single data point and understand the full story of how people navigate their daily need for water. Something to think about.